The Constitutional Court is hearing arguments on whether to postpone the local government elections scheduled for October. However, questions have been raised on whether does the Apex Court have the power to postpone elections. Another question is whether can the IEC hold free and fair elections during a pandemic. Joining me now is Martin van Staden, a legal expert, Gabriel Crouse, who's with the South African Institute for Race Relations, Safura, Abdool, Karim, a public health expert, Mkhuleko, Hlengwa, who's the IFP MP, Mncwabe, who's a spokesperson for the ATM, and Grant Masterson, who's with the EISA program manager there. Let's begin here with this question. Good afternoon to you all. I'll begin with you, Gabriel. Does the Constitutional Court have the power to postpone elections? You have 45 seconds.
Academically, in the abstract, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, because Section 172, the court has been told, allows it to do whatever it wants. It can break any part of the Constitution as long as there's a delay. No, because it's clearly said in Chapter 1 of the Constitution and Provision 159 that there's a hard deadline, you can't break it. But that's academic. The facts on the ground is that over 100 countries have had elections during this pandemic. The Commission was shown not one peer-reviewed article to connect any of those elections to a spike in infections. Tanzania just had a very successful election. Egypt, Ghana, South Africa itself had by-elections. At a practical level, we can have the election with COVID as long as we reopen the registrations to allow those people to register who were denied by the Minister and by the Electoral Commission unjustly. And that was unconstitutional. That must be remedied. Other than that, we can go ahead.
Safura? You are on mute, unfortunately.
Sorry. I think that Gabriel's hit it on the head, which is this is the million-dollar question that the Constitutional Court is being asked to answer, because there's two conflicting provisions. There's a power that enables the court to make just and equitable remedies. There's also a power that allows the court to declare unconstitutional behavior invalid but suspend that order of invalidity. At the same time, many other countries have gone forward with their elections. However, the bigger question is, can you hold free and fair elections with all of the requisite campaigning, registration, etc. during COVID? And given the time frame, I think that's a huge question mark.
Spo?
Well, thank you, Mangat. I think the election can go ahead. The Constitutional Court, as far as we are concerned, do not have that power to amend the Constitution. We believe that the whole COVID thing has been exaggerated by the IEC. There was no need to create this confusion. We have had by-elections that were free and fair within this era of COVID-19. There is no need to really create a confusion in this thing. Let the Constitution be obeyed. Let's go ahead with the elections. There is absolutely no need. The IEC, together with us as political parties, we must find a way to do our work within the parameters of the situation that we are facing in. We must be innovative, creative, like all other countries, the countries that have just had elections, like Zambia and others. The issue of free and fair, as far as we are concerned, does not come in. Let us come up with the ways, safety measures to do the work, and stop creating unnecessary confusion.
Your 45
There is
minutes
absolutely
is
no
up.
need to postpone elections.
All right. Grant?
Well, I must say that the contributions so far align with my own personal views. But at the same time, when I listen to the statement that free and fair elections doesn't come into it, I scratch my head, because this is coming from political parties who very typically are the first ones to cry foul if they don't believe that the principles of freedom and fairness have been applied in an election. Of course, this directly affects their own fortunes at the polls. So this is not a black and white issue. This is not one where there is an obvious correct answer. And I think that the freedom and fairness of the election itself is just as critical as every other consideration that we need to find here.
Mashasha?
Well, thank you very much. And at the outset, let me say the IFP will abide with whatever the Constitutional Court says. And if they say we must go to elections, we will do so within the parameters of what will be defined. However, what is important here is that we are dealing with a pandemic which has got shifting goalposts and therefore putting lives at risk. you have got millions of South Africans who are unregistered, and because of the proclamation of the date of the election, they can't register. Elections are not an event, they are a process. And that process has already been disrupted by this pandemic. Voter registration has been interrupted. Political parties in the main, whom are one of the key major stakeholders, have got internal processes for the nomination and election of candidates for these elections, and that has been a problem. We've got 20,000 voter stations in the country, which will all have to open simultaneously. And of course, we are creating wall-to-wall super spreader events in the country. The health considerations have to be looked at. The saving of lives has to be looked at. And the question of by-elections is one which is on shifting ground. By-elections have been postponed because of the pandemic. And so that is not a solid argument. Countries may have held elections, but none of us seated here, citing Tanzania, for example, can trust their numbers. For obvious reasons, particularly, so ultimately the issue here that we are saying is the Constitutional Court, one example, declared that the contract for the disbursement of SASSA grants with CPS Net 1 was irregular.
Mkhuleko, I'm going to come to you.
For 18 months for that contract to proceed. I'll
come back to you with that point. Your 45 minutes is up. Martin, you're the final one to answer this question.
Thank you. Yeah. Our question is simply, is South Africa a country that subscribes to the rule of law, or is it a country that plays fast and loose with the Constitution whenever there are any number of good reasons to set aside a constitutional provision for convenience sake? The fact of the matter is Section 159 of the Constitution is very clear about when a municipal election has to be held. There is no discretion on the part of any court or any organ of state to go beyond that parameter. The Constitutional Court has no power whatsoever to suspend any provision of the Constitution. It may suspend an order declaring certain behavior unconstitutional and it may suspend the effect of that, but it may not suspend, in effect, a provision of the Constitution, which is exactly what the court would be doing if it grants the IEC's application. Now, I want to be unequivocal with this. Come hell or high water, legally and constitutionally, there must be a municipal election in this country before the 1st of November. If that does not happen, the written constitutionalism, the text of our Constitution, would for the first time since 1994 have been deprived in a very, very serious way. And that is not something I think constitutionalists can allow to happen.
Okay, thank you to you all for answering this question. Safura, I'd like to start off with you. Some have said that looking at the current, wave of hesitancy and the dip that we have seen when it comes to the vaccination drive, it may not be wise to have elections in October because the population may not have been vaccinated in numbers as government is hoping for. Would you agree with that?
So I just need to put one caveat to my expertise, which is I'm not a public health expert, I'm a public health law expert. So what I can say is that, we haven't had a high coverage of vaccines, but many of the countries that had elections, including the US, didn't have a high coverage of vaccines or high vaccination rate when they had elections. What I can say is that a lot of there are other alternatives to vaccination that can validly stop the spread of COVID-19. We've been employing many of them during our efforts to flatten the curve. So it's not just about whether or not we have high vaccination rates. The last comment I'll make is that there's no guarantee that we're going to have, population level immunity from vaccines in February next year. So we should be very cautious to tie the postponement of the elections to vaccination coverage, because that's not the end all and be all of this pandemic. It's not going to end overnight if everybody's vaccinated, if I can just put it that way.
Swo, you are nodding vehemently.
Well, look, the issue of vaccination, as my colleague have said, it's really not guaranteed that by February the whole population will be vaccinated. Remember, November, December, and January, that's a festive season as well. You might find that in February you'll be told that because of a festive season, there's been high infections. So we are debating this matter on the basis of predictions and guessing. So that is why we should just allow the Constitution to play its course. Because remember, we've been told by the health expert and the president of the country that we must prepare ourselves to live with things for some time. Now, we cannot keep on shifting critical issues of governance critical issues of the state on the basis of our fears, our predictions and guessing. We cannot extend period of corruption. We know what is happening in municipalities. Some are no longer functioning at all. We need serious intervention. So let's move and remove those who are unable to deliver service to our people and not use this COVID-19 to try and cheat people. Let's go ahead and have election, have a new governance there, start servicing our people. We cannot debate these matters on the basis of predictions. Remember, this virus itself is very much unpredicted. It keeps on changing phases and all what we see. Therefore, we cannot delay the governance of the country on those bases. Let's go ahead like all other countries. Of course, within the health measures, we put parameters that will guide the safety of our people.
Gabriel, some have said that the pushing ahead of the election to be held on the 27th of October might put the population at risk because it might cause others to potentially violate some of the lockdown regulations and queue in numbers in order for them then to be allowed to cast their votes. What happens here in this, what would you say needs to be done in order to balance that, the livelihoods as well as people being able then to access the voting stations should the election go ahead?
Yeah, so this election is the lifeblood of our constitutional democracy. You've heard from the constitutional side how clear the provision is. You've heard from the democratic side how many millions of South Africans are being let down by corrupt local government officials, and they need the right to hold them to account. Just another form of lifeblood is SASSA grants payments. In the last municipal election, it was 15 million people voting. Every month, 18 million people receive SASSA grants payments. Most have to queue to get those payments. Every day, even more millions of South Africans have to queue taxi ranks to get to work, queue at grocery stores to get food. It's the lifeblood of our people to keep moving. That is what we have to do. And this democracy question is as essential of all of those other questions. We must use exactly the same measures. We must abide by social distancing. We must wash our hands. We must mask. We must be very careful in a queue, and a queue is not a gathering. A queue is a strict thing, and it must be abided by properly, like a grants queue. On that regard, I will say that many of the political parties who were represented spoke to the good faith of South Africans. But unfortunately, the representative for the IFP, and I was very surprised because I know the IFP well to be a law and order party, but the representative, the legal representative, told the Constitutional Court there will be no mitigation of viral spread from social distancing, because South Africans are so lawless that if you give them the chance to vote, they will just break all of the regulations and they will be dancing together in the streets and they will be spreading the virus. I believe that that legal representative was not actually representing the IFP properly, and I believe that legal representative does not know about South Africa. In South Africa, we are serious about voting. The struggle to vote was the most serious thing that has happened before my lifetime, but it's still in living memory. And people, if they get the chance to vote, will be serious about that. They will queue in a strict and disciplined fashion because it is the lifeblood of our constitutional democracy. And I think people take it very, very seriously. They will do it carefully.
Strong words for you, Mkhuleko, from Gabriel.
Well, I mean, the fundamental issue here is that we are concerned about the health of our people. And as we have seen in previous months, and as is currently, people continue partying, continue breaking the laws of COVID-19 insofar as funerals are concerned and so on and so forth. So I don't think we need anybody outside the IFP to become the alpha and omega of the outlook that we have. The second point is this. We are saddled with a situation where the lockdown which is in place is within the Disaster Management Act. So the country currently is not operating within the spectrum of normality. We are in a state of disaster. And therefore, to want to forge ahead as if we are in normal times is in itself reckless and irresponsible. Thirdly, the IFP fundamentally believes that the elections must take place. But the elections have to be free and fair because that is what makes elections legitimate. And an independent commission has come out and said that holding elections now will render us having elections that are not free and fair. So the pushback, I would have imagined from Gabriel, should have also gone there, that in this very panel, we've been told by the ATM that the dictates of free and fair are not important. So let's not cherry pick on the political party pushback that we want. The final point I want to make, is that this is not a political issue that we are dealing with here. And therefore, that is why we believe taking this matter to Parliament makes it a political football. We need the sobriety of the Constitutional Court during a very difficult moment of reckoning for all of us to be given a direction which can satisfy the fact that the elections will be free and fair, free from fear, and credible. How can we as parties in good faith deploy our volunteers on the ground to go and do door-to-door and all sorts of other campaigns moving? Because as I'm saying, to assume that elections are just on the 27th of October and negate all the other electoral processes is the highest form of political ignorance and electoral process ignorance that can characterize any discussion that we have. But I want to reiterate that if you look at the lines of 1994, which are the hallmark of what our democracy means for all of us, and then explain to me how you're going to social distance those people. You're going to have kilometers upon kilometers more than we've seen before. Why are we subjecting our people to the kind of reckless planning of the IEC in itself, which has only one job, by the way, which is to prepare for elections? And they have not done so. That is by their own admission. And then now must adopt a herd mentality and say, IEC has failed, but continue anyway. These are people's lives that we are putting at risk here, and which would be the highest form of irresponsibility and recklessness to forge ahead in the absence of an IEC, which in itself has compromised these elections. What happens to those that are not registered? You've got an election declared. These elections have already been interrupted by the interventions that have been made. So, I mean, looking at
that can be
reality,
fixed, by the way. If I can just jump in to say about the registration, I completely agree with you there. It can be fixed before. And the IEC has said it can register. The IEC itself has said it can register on the 18th and 19th of September. And the court's been shown that if the IEC opens that registration weekend for the 18th and 19th of September, it can still go ahead with the 27th of October election. But the IEC has said it can do that. So
Gabriel, I'm going to get into the issue of the voter registration in just a moment, because that in and itself is a contention. But I'd like to bring in Grant into this conversation, who's been chuckling away for quite some time now. Grant, when you look at what has been said, some are simply saying that the IEC should have just gone straight to Parliament instead of going to the courts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that Gabriel was a bit harsh on the IFP there, because that was, in fact, the IFP's core thrust of their submission, was that there should be a delay, it should be an extended delay, and that this should buy the time for a parliamentary process. I think that the other important point that Mkhuleko made there is that we are currently living in a period where elements of this very constitution that we are saying is categorically unambiguous about whether or not the elections can and cannot take place beyond this period have already been suspended. Both states of emergency and states of disaster suspend elements of the Constitution. Now we are sitting beyond day 500 of a situation in which elements of the Constitution are suspended, and therefore we have accepted those on a public health basis. It cannot be as black and white as we would like this to be. The issue at stake here is that the Constitutional Court will decide, and because they are deciding whether or not to allow what the IEC is requesting, the Constitutional Court does have the authority here to make this decision. Otherwise, the IEC would not be going to the Constitutional Court. Whether or not they choose to use the powers available to them is a different story altogether.
Martin, you're shaking your head?
Yeah, no, I believe that's total nonsense, of course. If we now decide that we've played fast and loose with the constitution during COVID-19, and we should just add to that now. We may as well take the whole thing and throw it in the trash. We should stop appealing to South Africa being a constitutional democracy if that is the way we want to continue forward. Now, there have been rights that were limited under Section 36 of the Constitution, but any other suspension of the Constitution that has occurred should be challenged in court. But the fact of the matter is the court does not have this authority. It's not about us being reckless or irresponsible or anything like that. The court does not supersede the Constitution. The court is an institution of the Constitution that must abide strictly by its prescripts. And we will, and during any election, there will be a host of good reasons that one might dream up to delay or postpone or suspend the elections. But we cannot allow that when we have the highest law in our country telling us exactly when we have to have those elections. We are playing fast and loose with the rule of law here, and that is incredibly dangerous. That is not a precedent we want to set, especially not when it comes to voting and democracy.
I see, Mkhuleko, you're shaking your head vehemently, but before you come in, I'd like us to take just a short breather and come back to this conversation. And one of the things, Safura, I need you and I to look into, and what this is going to be looking like, is that, you know, when we are in a public health emergency, it's important for us to get experts to guide us on how we can do this, especially in an election, to ensure that they're free and fair, but at the same time, you are protecting the people that are out there who are going to be going into the polls. Let's continue answering some of these difficult questions, because not only did the IEC have a difficult time to convince the Constitutional Court, but as we wait then to see which way the courts will rule, I'd like to then probe you also on other matters when it comes to voter registration. We continue with this debate in just a moment. Let's continue then our conversation, which really has been quite heated on whether or not the Constitutional Court does have the mandate or even the power to postpone the election. Let's continue with Martin van Staden, who's a legal expert, Gabriel Crouse, who is with the South African Institute for Race Relations, Safura Abdool, Karim, a public health expert, Mkhuleko Hlengwa, who is an IFP MP, Mncwabe ATM spokesperson, Grant Masterson, who's with EISA, who's the program manager there. Safura, when we were, in fact, before I come back to Safura, Mkhuleko, you were vehemently shaking your head as, Martin was really talking about just how, the Constitutional Court really is not the playing field when it comes to this particular argument to be playing out.
Yes, if you take this matter to Parliament, you're going to subject it to partisan politics, much to the exclusion, really, of the rank and file of the South African population insofar as the representativity is concerned, NGOs and so on, whom have from time to time had a keen interest in participating on these matters. The issue of public hearings in Parliament is one thing. The vote on the floor will be purely political. This will become a political decision. And it is not a political decision at this point. It is a health consideration, and we are putting it to the independence of the Constitutional Court to make a determination, because the Constitution, by the way, is a living document. And we rather have it actually interpreted correctly by the Constitutional Court as the highest body of conflict resolution, as the apex court in this country. The political parties are becoming players and referees if you take this matter to Parliament. Look at the proposals that are there. May 2022, as the IFP has been saying, there's people speaking about February. You've got other parties speaking about pushing these elections to merge them all the way to 2024. So you already then muddy the waters if you subject this kind of discussion to the politics. Secondly,
but you need a supermajority. Just the point on that is you need a 3/4 supermajority. And if all 3/4 of the floor agreed, then it wouldn't be political anymore. It would be multiple parties that would be required in order to amend the Constitution. I agree, if it's one party or another party, then it's political. But if it's 3/4 of Parliament, then it's no longer political. Then it's a unanimous expression of the people's will.
That's a very, very shaky ground argument you make there, because ultimately that decision by political parties, as you've already seen, that there's mandates and caucuses which direct how political parties work. You saw with the issue of the removal of Jacob Zuma as president, that members were given a mandate on how to vote. So it's all political, and for those of us in that space know exactly how it is. The second point is, you spoke about actually earlier, Gabriel, about how the IEC has said they can hold voter registration. Yes, they can, but that's not dependent on them. That is dependent on what level of the lockdown we are at. So at this point in time, the IEC's hands are tied. And so you need to give the clear direction and guidance in terms of what needs to happen. What also comes into question would be then the legality of the IEC opening the voters' roll after the proclamation of the elections. Either way, all these complex matters need to be interpreted legally as opposed to the political imagination which has characterized this discourse. And
Safura,
the fact that the court has accepted this matter to listen to is in itself something that should comfort us to know we've got a constitutional court that is prepared to listen.
Safura, one of the submissions that you made to the Mkhuleko inquiry is that if we are to have elections in a time where infections are quite high, we're running the risk of a lower vote turnout.
Sorry, I didn't hear a question. That is correct.
So for me, it was like, listening to what Mkhuleko and Gabriel are saying, and Martin as well, and when you listen closely to Martin, he says we should be forging ahead, but should infections be high at that time, we might find ourselves with not enough people being at the polls to be able to cast their votes, because I don't get a sense that the IEC might be ready to carry out such an election.
I think it's a very important issue that's being raised here, and it's something that I think Grant tried to allude to earlier, which is, we've been talking about what can be put in place to mitigate the spread of COVID on an election day. But what we haven't really tried to understand, and hasn't been poorly understood across the world, is what type of effect COVID-19 has on the overall free and fairness of the elections, including voter turnout. There is lower voter turnout during COVID-19, that's true. We also have lower voter turnout because there's trends in lower numbers of voters coming to the polls. But also many of the activities that people engage in, specifically political parties, cannot be done in a COVID-compliant way. And I know we talk about moving into digital campaigning and things like that, but the reality is there's a huge digital divide in South Africa. And, I won't proclaim to have political expertise in these areas, but I can say that these are some very important issues that I don't think we've considered. And when we look at how other countries have held their elections, this has been the challenge. We can put in place social distancing at the polls, we can make sure that everybody's wearing masks and sanitizing, but how can we ensure that the free and fairness of the elections isn't negatively impacted? And I think in that regard, the Mkhuleko inquiry's report flags that as an issue and identifies that it is difficult to hold free and fair elections when there is this digital divide and there is this suppression of kind of campaigning activity in the lead up to elections. So I think that is the broader question that some of us should be looking at when we make a declaration that free and fair elections are possible. An election is possible. Is it fully free and fair? That's a question.
So when one looks at what has been said, by some political parties that are calling for the postponement, is that they've not been able to hit the ground running in terms of campaigning, in terms of making sure that those that are to be heading to the polls are given enough of a choice for them to hear what each political party is all about, and simply holding these online may not suffice for a country like ours with deeply divided inequalities. A party like the EFF is suggesting that we push this to April 2022. Give us a sense then of, should the election go ahead in October, would political parties have done enough though on the ground to woo the voters, and would the voters have had enough time to make up their minds?
Well, I think, Mangete, must not run away from the fact that it is the duty of political parties as well, as I've said earlier on, to be innovative and creative within this era, within the pandemic that we are facing, how do we carry our message out to our people? How do we make sure that our manifestos are able to be listened to by the people? How do we make the better way of giving our people the information within this pandemic that we are facing? We should not be the lazy thinkers as political parties. We must be creative and come up with all the ways that can be able to assist our own organization to pass through the message to people.
At a practical level, those who talk to us about how the ATM will ensure that it sends their message to the electorate during this time. What creative ideas have you developed behind the scenes?
As we all know, we are living in the world now of technology. That is social media, for instance. That is all the things that we should use or will be using to make sure that we access as many people as we can. Even if there was no pandemic, but the truth is we are now living in a highly technological society. We must embrace that and use it to give the information out to our people as much as we can. We cannot, as the time goes, continue using the traditional way of campaigning, the traditional way of reaching the voters. We must be innovative and use the technology that we use every day to reach our people, especially our young people who are much more on social media and other platforms.
Grant, social media is not a reflection of the entire country, and as some would like to believe that we are highly technological, it may not be the case for those who do not have devices or don't even know what's on social media, especially given what Sbu is saying.
That's right. Look, of course, social media is only a fraction of what we see in our daily lived life in South Africa. I think that the campaigning element is one key element of this, but let's also not ignore the other pre-election elements which are critical. We've touched on the voter registration, which has been disrupted. That is unavoidable. Right now, as we sit, we are sitting with a disrupted voter registration process ahead of these local government elections. We need to be able to bring the people who wanted to register ahead of these elections or who wanted to change the locale within which they vote for these elections to make that possible, and that has been disrupted. Another key element which has been disrupted in the pre-election due to the limitations imposed by our state of disaster has been the nomination processes internally within parties. It has been very difficult for the parties to gather with the necessary quorums in various branches and various locations because there have been restrictions on the numbers of people who can physically gather in one place. So we can't just reduce this to the pre-election being equal to the campaigning environment, which has been affected, and as the Mncwabe report very clearly outlines, would continue to be affected. And we've got to remember that at the fundamental basis of a democracy is the informed vote of the voter. The voter needs to be given the information they need to make an informed choice. And so that is as important in preparing for these elections as the other matters we're considering here.
What do we say, though, Grant, to those who are saying that this is a self-created crisis? The IEC could see that we are in the midst of a pandemic and they would have had to find themselves in a position like this one, and then making a move at the 11th hour, as some have suggested, is in fact in and itself a useless and a futile exercise.
I think that there is some basis for a criticism of the timing of all of this. Of course, it has been very difficult to predict the trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic, and every health expert who delivered a submission to the Mncwabe report team emphasized that predicting anything about the coronavirus has been impossible from the beginning. And so to cast our mind back and think about what the IEC might have and should have and could have done, there may be some valid criticism there. But of course, like everyone else, the IEC is dealing with a very fluid and a very changing situation.
Martin, when we come back from just on the other side of this breather, I would like you and I to really talk about whether or not what the arguments were made by the IEC hold water here, because they had a difficult time when they said that they're not seeking a constitutional amendment, but they want the elections to be postponed. I need us to look at whether or not can these two be mutually exclusive. And let's talk about that in just a moment as we continue then with this debate. Let's inch closer now to the end of our debate and bring in legal expert Martin van Staden. Martin, one of the issues that the IEC had a difficult time in trying to persuade the Constitutional Court to understand is that they were saying they're not seeking a constitutional amendment for the elections, but they want the elections to be postponed. Can these two, though, be read mutually exclusive?
Well, look, what the IEC is doing is exactly that. They are seeking a constitutional amendment. I keep coming back to Section 1592 of the Constitution. It says that an election must be held within 90 days of the end of a municipal council's term. That is very clear English, and there's no room for interpretation, really. So what the IEC is asking the court to do, in effect, is to amend the Constitution. Now, the court doesn't have the power to do that, but it might try. So if the IEC, I apologize, wishes to amend to postpone the election, it would need to amend the Constitution, and its time would have been far better spent over the last few months speaking to the political parties, telling them we need to get this constitutional amendment through before we enter that period where we are now, where it would be impossible for the Constitution to be amended before the deadline of 1 November. So the IEC could have spent its time much more constructively than it has up until now. But the fact of the matter is it does need to amend the Constitution if it wants to get what it seeks from the court. And in that way, yes, they are mutually exclusive. The court cannot postpone the election. The only way this election could be postponed is through a constitutional amendment. And if that process starts today, it will only be done by sometime late next year. So that's not going to be the IEC's solution at this stage.
Safura, while protecting, the voting system and ensuring that everybody goes to the polls, and at the same time making sure that they do so safely and can vote securely, when is likely to be a less risky time for the elections to be held, especially when you look at a public, health perspective? Or could we then find ourselves in a situation, if we forge ahead, where the police will be inundated with trying to ensure that the COVID-19 protocols are adhered to at the polls, and thus posing another difficulty of law and order there?
So I think that there isn't a clear consensus among the scientists about whether or not when would be the ideal time to have this election. Seems to be consensus that October wouldn't be a bad time, and that's based on the fact that the third wave is subsiding. We don't know what the fourth wave is going to look like. We don't know when it's going to happen. One of the submissions that was made to the commission included some projections about when we might see spikes, and those projections sort of indicated that February wouldn't be suitable, but that April might be. And so I think with the IEC's request to have some flexibility around when the elections could be held, that makes a lot of sense, because we don't know, for example, what variants of concern might emerge. We don't know, what our vaccination coverage might be, and we don't know whether or not our vaccines will be effective against the next variant that's driving the fourth wave, let alone whether or not we're going to have one. So I think, there is so much uncertainty. I think that's not a question. I would love to just add one point to what Martin said, because he's talking in very categorical terms as though there's no debate whatsoever in the law. And I would just flag the IEC's alternative request, or their alternative remedy, which is to have the postponement of the elections declared unconstitutional, but for that declaration of invalidity to be suspended until such time as they can hold the elections. And that's a completely valid course of action that has been done previously. It hasn't been done, to the best of my knowledge, for prospective unconstitutional behavior. But I just wanted to flag that it's not completely black and white. There is some legal room. That's why the Constitutional Court is hearing this. This is why their judgment will be very important, because we do need clarity on these questions.
And Gabriel, some have said that the argument that elections have been held elsewhere around the world easily during a pandemic may not hold water, especially because we might find the trust element eroded here, and some of these results then being taken to the courts and prolonging the process then, or even the IEC in itself not being able to hold the election during a pandemic. What do you say then to those who are saying that argument of elections being held around the world does not hold water when it comes to South Africa.
Yeah, it was very concerning to see that ANC and the EFF especially tell the court that South Africa is an S-hole country, to paraphrase the useless former American president. They said South Africa is so terrible that it's alone in the world cannot hold an election. Other countries in the continent of Africa can hold an election. Other countries in Europe can hold an election. In Asia, they can hold an election. In South America, they can amend the constitution to postpone a little bit through parliament, but then also hold the election. But we can't go through parliament and we can't hold an election, and our political parties are too useless to even get their act together to get their nominations and so on. The ATM said, no, we can do it. The DA said, no, we can do it. Other political parties said, no, we can do it. But the EFF and the ANC especially said South Africa is too useless to do anything. So we must rather just not be a democracy for now. I thought that argument was shocking. I think that South Africa is much better than that. And to bring it in with one of the elements of the discussion we've had here today, the thought is coronavirus is a health crisis. Of course it's a health crisis. But who can pretend that only politicians are aware of that? Who can pretend that only the IEC is aware of that? Insofar as ordinary South Africans know that this is a health crisis, ordinary South Africans are going to behave differently in this election to how they behaved in the last election. And the IEC was shown by previous judgments of the Constitutional Court, including by quotes from Chief Justice Mkhuleko, that there is no established test for free and fair. But what there is a contextual analysis that must always be made. Freeness and fairness must always be understood within the context of this election. And the acting Chief Justice Zondo said the same thing in his opening remarks, that a free and fair election can look differently in 2021 to how it looked in 2016. And in 2026, it can look differently again to how it looks in 2021. Human beings adapt, we change, and it's that innovation, it's that sense of where there's a will, there's a way, that I find so lacking in those who would like the election to be postponed. It seems to me like the governing party especially has given up on governing in various municipalities. They've been dissolved. They've given up on passing clean audited information. You look at the Auditor's General Report, it's shocking how many government officials have given up on South Africa. Now they want South Africans to give up on our hard-won constitutional democracy. For me, that is too much. It cannot be. It must be that ordinary South Africans have enough common sense to socially distance. It must be that ordinary South Africans know that this is an exceptional circumstance and so will deal with their politicians unusually. I'm a journalist in some of my work. I go around and I see many journalists from Newzroom Afrika speaking to people in the heartland, in the rural heartland, door to door. It can be done with a mask, with social distance. Okay, you can't press flesh. You can't hold the babies as you can in a usual election, but you can go door to door and speak to people. Right. You can use social media innovatively. Where there's a will, there's a way. And I believe that that argument that other countries can do it, but South Africa is so useless that we can't do it, is an insult to this beautiful nation and this hard-won constitutional democracy that we must continue to fight for today.
Swo, some have said, though, that it'll be difficult to observe the protocols, the COVID-19 protocols, despite what, Gabriel is saying, that people will be able to adhere to social distancing. We've seen a very clear flouting of regulations then. How do you propose that these be done should the elections continue in October?
Well, firstly, our worry is that when we debate this matter, we debate it as if we are leading a society that does not know what is happening in the country, that does not know how this pandemic can be avoided. Our people are well educated now about this thing. They are taking trains, buses, taxis every day. They are quite aware. They go to malls, they go to post offices to collect grants and queue there. They are quite aware of what is happening. It's unfortunate that we debate it as if our people are not aware of what is going on. That's number one. But number two, on the issue of complying with the regulations, indeed, I believe, and we believe as ATM, our people do comply. There are, yes, those instances where there might be some challenges on few people, but our people do comply. Look at the recovery rate of COVID infections. It's very high, meaning that our people are really taking care of themselves. What worries us as ATM is that when we push for this thing, we should not open a can of worms for ourselves in the future of amending the constitution anyhow, when the corrupt government will seek to sit in power, keeps on amending the constitution on very unwise reasons, just to keep kings on power. So we can't be fighting this thing, but let us not open future can of worms constitutionally for us as a country. Because at some stage, some people can use these things when they're in power and want to clean in power forever and continue with their corruption, to come up with unpredictable situations to amend the law, to amend the constitution. Right. As we debate this, let us be cautious of not creating a future problem for our people in this country.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but let me thank you all for your insightful conversations this afternoon, and I do wish that the Constitutional Court would have heard some of the arguments that in fact are being made here on the show, because really quite a fiery debate we've just had. Thank you so much to you all for your time. Certainly do appreciate it. That was Martin van Staden, who is a legal expert, Gabriel Crouse, who is with the South African Institute for Race Relations, Safura Abdool, Karim, a public health law expert, Mkhuleko Hlengwa, who is the IFP spokesperson, Mncwabe, who is a spokesperson for the ATM, and Grant Masterson, who is a program manager at EISA.